everyone, and welcome to Computer Science for Self-Taught. And in today's video I'm going to teach you about the remaining parts of fragments from our previous tutorial. And in this tutorial I'm re-reviewing some properties of fragments from our previous lessons. So a fragment, as I have told you before, it is a piece of an activity which enables more modular activity design. It will not be wrong if I say a fragment is a kind of sub-activity. Of course, when you put fragments inside an activity, those fragments are called sub-activities. You can put as many of fragments inside your activity. And there are some important points you need to remember about fragments, that a fragment has its own layouts and its own behavior with its own lifecycle callbacks. When you add fragments inside an activity, if you add, for example, if you add 5 fragments inside one activity, each of those fragments have their own lifecycle, their own layouts, their own views, and their own callback method. And the next point you need to remember about fragment is that you can add or remove fragments in activity while the activity is running. In runtime, whenever your application is running and you can interact with it, you can also remove one fragment from that activity, and it does not affect other fragments, because as I've told you before, each fragment has its own lifecycle and its own callback methods. The next point you need to remember that you can combine multiple fragments in a single activity to build a multi-plane UI, your user interface. That's true about the fragments, that you can combine multiple fragments, one fragment inside another fragment. Even you can create a nested fragment in Android. So the next point you need to remember about is that a fragment can be used in multiple activities. When you create a fragment inside one activity and you want to use that fragment inside another activity, you can also do this, because it helps you to reuse the code. This is one of the concepts of the fragment, that you can reuse them in one activity and to another. You can use a fragment in more than one activity. This is the best thing that you need to remember about fragment, because fragment lifecycle is closely related to the lifecycle of its host activity, the parent activity that you put fragment inside that activity. Which means that when the activity is when the parent activity paused, all the fragments available in the activity will also be stopped and destroyed. The next point is a fragment can implement a behavior that has no user interface component, and fragments were added to the Android API in Honeycomb version of Android, which was API version, I think it was version 10 or 11. I think it was 11 that Honeycomb comes into existence, because fragments firstly designed to have multiple views in tablets. Then it was added to the cell phones. Right now you have got a little info from the previous video and also this video, which I re-reviewed them about the fragments. I have given you some extra information about those fragments. So before you create a fragment, you must consider so many steps. You can create fragments by extending fragment class. Fragment class, as I have done in here, I have already created a layout for that, okay? And I also created a class, and that class extends from the fragments. And you can insert fragment into your activity layout by declaring the fragment in the activity layout. For example, in here you can also do that by the tag fragment. This is the way that you add fragment inside the layout. And if you want to put multiple fragments inside one activity, make sure that you use a separate layout for each of them. And here I have got 2 fragments, and for each fragment I have created loosely coupled relative layout. Otherwise, if you don't do this, your app will crash and you won't see the output, like in here as I have done the fragment tag. Prior to the fragment introduction, we had a limitation because we can show only a single activity on the screen at one given point in time, so we were not able to divide device screen and control different parts separately. But with the introduction of fragment, we got more flexibility and removed the limitation of having a single activity on the screen at a time. Now we can have a single activity, but each activity can have comprised of multiple fragments which will have their own layout, events, and complete their own life cycle. So now you have got some information about fragments. There are some steps that you must consider before creating fragments. I mean, how to use fragments. This involves a number of simple steps to create a fragment. First of all, decide how many fragments you want to use in an activity. For example, I have decided that I want to use 2 fragments inside one activity. We want to use 2 fragments. First of all, decide how many fragments you want to use in an activity. For instance, I want to use 2 fragments to handle landscape and portrait mode of the device. So let's do that first. So I'm going to remove all of the fragments from here. Let's add the fragments dynamically. So now I decide whenever I rotate the screen like this, the second fragment should appear, and when I come to portrait mode, another fragment appear. So how to do this? For this we need to use the fragment manager class and fragment transaction, and then we use the display. With display we can determine that if our phone is in landscape mode or portrait mode. So as I've told you, before we create fragments, we must decide how many fragments we want to add inside one activity. So I've already created 2 fragments, and each of them have their own widget. And make sure that you extend from the fragment class. In here, if I show you this example, class extends from the activity. Use the get fragment manager, okay? And if you use if your class extends from the compact activity, and and fragment was from the support library like this, use the get support fragment manager, because you provide support for the older versions of Android, and you want to make sure that your app is running in the older versions of Android. And if your class extends from activity and you use the get fragment manager, you have to know that your app will not run in the older versions of Android because you didn't provide the backward compatibility. So now I want to demonstrate an example of fragments, 2 fragments I mean, whenever I rotate the screen, so it moves from one fragment to another. How to do this? I want let's go to the main activity. In here I have already created 2 fragments and their relative classes also. Now I'm going to create, before I do this, I'm going to create a host layout for this. You can use as many, you can use your favorite layout, but in here I use the frame layout because it occupies the whole screen, and if I add something, frame layout overlaps that thing. So I'm going to use the frame layout, match parent, and you must determine an ID for this, because with this ID we are adding our fragments to this layout. Okay, my frame layout. Okay, that's it. So now let's go to our main activity. In here we need to import the fragment manager class. Make sure that you import from the support v4 library API. Click OK. Now let's create another object for this. Fragment manager get support fragment manager, because I want to run my application to the older versions of Android. Now I want to replace and remove fragments during runtime, and for that we need to use another class, because fragment manager doesn't have the add or remove methods. So to do that we use the fragment transaction, because with this class you're going to add, remove and replace the activity. Fragment transaction, make sure you also support provide from support v4 library equals to I use the object of fragment manager to begin the transaction. That's it. Now we can add, remove and replace by the object of fragment transaction. Before I do this, I want to use the display manager to determine whether our screen is rotating or not. I use the window manager. Window manager equals to get window manager, and now I use the object of display. Display equals to window manager dot get default display. With the object of get default display, now I can determine the rotation of our device. if the weight of the screen was greater than the height, it means our current activity is landscape, and if the weight was less than the height, so our phone is in portrait mode. How to do this? We can do that by providing a decision in here. I use if. You can use another condition. Now I say if display dot get weight. I mean if the display was if the weight of the screen was greater than the height, it means that our phone is in landscape mode. And if the weight was less than the height, then our phone is in portrait mode. So in here I'm going to choose that if the weight was greater than the height, it is in landscape. So I use the first fragment, which is first fragment, and if it was in the landscape, I'm going to use the second fragment. So I use the object of the fragment transaction to replace the screen. If t transaction dot replace. So in here I use the layout which I have added an activity. I'm going to use this frame layout, and I have given this an ID, frame layout r.id dot frame layout. And the second parameter, we need to create the object of our fragments. So I'm going to use I'm going to create the object of new fragment, new frag2, and put a semicolon here, because in frag2 we have the second activity, and in frag1 we have got the first activity. So if our phone was landscape, second fragment will appear, and if our phone was in portrait mode, so this first fragment will appear. And now I've replaced them. So if it was in landscape mode, bring the fragment 2, which is this fragment, and if it was in portrait mode, bring the first fragment. I'm going to replace that. So easy. If transaction dot replace, choose the layout r.id dot frame layout, and create an instance of frag2, frag1. That's it. So let's run. I'm going to toast a message in here to make sure that it is in portrait. Now if I compile and run this, we will see the effect. If I rotate my phone, so it's going to open the second activity. If it was in portrait mode, it opens the first activity, first fragment. After replacing, we must also commit our changes. So I use the if transaction dot commit, because it's going to commit our changes. So let's rerun this and see the effect. Make sure you also use commit after replacing, adding, and removing the fragments from activity. You see, our phone is now in portrait mode. In here, I use the window manager. It returns the display right now. So if the weight was greater than height, right now the weight is less than the height. So it moves to the else statement, and it shows the first fragment. Now if I rotate the phone, and now the weight is now greater than the height, so it pops up a message and it tells us that landscape mode, and it brings the second fragment. Let's do this. That's it, landscape mode, second fragment. It's so easy. You can create as many activities as you want. So that's it for today's video. So this brings us to the end of this particular tutorial, and if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icons. Otherwise, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. And if you have any questions or suggestions, make sure that you write them in the comment section below. I will try to answer them ASAP. Have fun learning. Peace out.